Imagine someone uploads an old employee training tape to YouTube. No description, no explanation, no indication that it's fiction. Just a faded company logo and 30 minutes of outdated workplace instructions. Most people would scroll past it, but analog horror understands something unusual. The most effective horror rarely announces itself. It behaves as though you weren't supposed to find it. Halfway through the tape, the narrator calmly says,
"If the person outside the door knows your name, do not respond. Employees do not use names after midnight."
Nothing happens. No scream, no monster, just one impossible rule inside an ordinary world. And suddenly, your mind starts asking questions the tape never answers. That's where analog horror begins. Not where something appears, but when something stops making sense. People often think analog horror is about VHS tapes, static,
and distorted audio.
It isn't. Those are only the language that the genre speaks. Its real strength is uncertainty inside familiar things. Most horror follows the same pattern: a shadow, a strange sound, a glimpse of something moving. For a while, your imagination builds the monster. Then eventually, the monster steps into the light. You understand what it is, how it behaves, maybe even how to defeat it. The mystery becomes information, and information is rarely as frightening as uncertainty. Here's what makes analog horror different. It rarely tries to scare you directly. Instead, it gives your brain something it can't completely explain. Everything else we'll talk about is simply a different way of doing that. Good horror doesn't hide everything forever. It simply knows when to stop explaining. That's why Gemini Home Entertainment works so well. The series disguises itself as educational television, wildlife documentaries, camping guides, medical information. Everything feels ordinary, until it doesn't. A camping guide calmly explains what to do if something in the forest begins behaving like a person. A medical tape discusses an impossible disease with complete professionalism. Nobody panics, nobody explains. The nightmare is treated as routine. That's what makes Gemini unsettling. Not the creatures, the normality. You're the only one reacting. Everyone inside the tape has already accepted the impossible. But the uncertainty is not enough on its own. Analog horror also corrupts familiarity. Notice how often it begins with something we instinctively trust: emergency broadcasts, school tapes, weather reports, corporate training videos. Instead of inventing dangerous places, it turns safe ones against us. That's exactly what Local 58 does. An emergency broadcast tells you to stay inside. Moments later, another broadcast, with the same authority, tells you to do the opposite. Suddenly, the horror isn't the moon, it's the realization that you no longer know which voice deserves your trust. Imagine a fire alarm telling you to walk deeper into a burning building. The danger hasn't changed. Your certainty has. That's the pattern we've seen already. Gemini questions reality. Local 58 questions authority. Neither relies on loud scares. Both remove certainty from something familiar, and your mind immediately starts trying to restore it. The problem is, it never can. That's why analog horror rarely scares you while you're watching. It gives your brain a question it can't stop trying to answer, and that question often follows you long after the video ends. If uncertainty is the foundation of analog horror, familiarity is the trap. The genre rarely invents completely alien worlds. Instead, it starts with things you already understand: a television station, a family restaurant, a human face. Then it changes exactly one detail. Not enough to break reality, just enough to make you question it. That's often all it takes. There's a reason analog horror keeps returning to faces. Our brains recognize them almost instantly. A smile, a glance, a tiny change in expression. We are incredibly good at noticing when something feels off. That's why the Mandela Catalogue doesn't need spectacular monsters. Its alternates don't terrify us because they're powerful. They terrify us because they're almost convincing. The smile is slightly too wide. The eyes don't quite focus. The face looks human until it doesn't. The series isn't asking you to identify a monster, it's asking a far more uncomfortable question. How certain are you that the person standing in front of you is really who you think they are? There isn't a satisfying answer, and that's exactly why the fear lingers. But familiar faces aren't the only things that become unsettling. Sometimes it's familiar places. That's where the Walten Files takes a different approach. A family restaurant, bright mascots, cheerful training tapes. Everything feels strangely nostalgic. Not because it's safe, but because it reminds you of something that used to be. The series isn't really about haunted animatronics. It's about memory. Childhood already feels incomplete. We don't remember every room, every conversation, every face. Memory is full of gaps. Analog horror doesn't need to create uncertainty, it simply hides inside uncertainty that already exists. Imagine revisiting a restaurant that you loved as a child. The building is abandoned. The lights should be off, yet somewhere inside, the music is still playing. Nothing appears, nothing attacks you. But suddenly, you're no longer sure whether you're remembering the place or whether the place has been remembering you. By now, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Gemini questions reality, Local 58 questions authority, the Mandela Catalogue questions identity, the Walten Files questions memories. Different stories, different monsters, different worlds. Yet they're all reaching for the same outcome, not fear through spectacle, fear through uncertainty. Every series leaves one piece missing, one question unanswered, one detail that refuses to fit. Because analog horror doesn't ask you to watch the horror, it asks you to participate in it. Your mind quietly finishes what the screen refuses to explain, which raises a more interesting question. What happens when a creator stops leaving those gaps? What happens when analog horror starts explaining everything? Up to this point, every series we've talked about shares one important trait: restraint. They leave something unresolved, not because the creators forgot to explain it, but because they knew not to. That raises an interesting question. What happens when analog horror stops holding back? For me, UrbanSPOOK the Painter is the most interesting answer. Not because it's the best analog horror, but because it shows what happens when the genre changes its priorities. Unlike Gemini or the Mandela Catalogue, the Painter rarely asks your imagination to fill in the blanks. Instead, it often tells you exactly what happened. Each victim is introduced, the investigation follows, the crime is described, the mystery becomes increasingly complete. That's one reason the series divides audiences. Some people find it deeply disturbing. Others feel it mistakes graphic detail for fear. I don't think the violence is the real issue. The issue is certainty. There's an important difference between shock and horror. Shock asks you to react. Horror asks you to imagine. Shock is immediate. Horror is delayed. It follows you home. It returns hours later when your mind keeps trying to solve something the story refused to explain. That's why restraint matters. The creator gives you half of the nightmare. Your imagination creates the other half. Once everything is shown, there's nothing left for your imagination to do. I don't think analog horror becomes weaker because creators run out of ideas. I think it becomes weaker because success creates pressure to explain everything. Audiences want lore, answers. That's natural, but horror has always depended on the opposite instinct. Every successful horror story faces the same temptation: to explain itself. The best ones know when to stop. That pressure doesn't come only from creators, it comes from us. Every horror monster eventually faces the same enemy: the fandom. The moment a series becomes popular, people begin documenting everything. Every hidden frame, every symbol, every timeline, every creature. I've done it myself. It's fun. But something quietly changes. The monster stops feeling unknowable. It becomes information, then analysis, and eventually, trivia. The mystery that once terrified us slowly becomes something we can organize into a wiki, and the more completely we understand it, the less frightening it usually becomes. Maybe that's why the best analog horror never answers every question. It understands something many horror stories eventually forget. The unknown isn't a problem waiting to be solved. It's the source of the fear itself. So why did analog horror find its home on YouTube? Not because of VHS filters, not because of the algorithm, because YouTube makes discovery feel accidental. A horror film tells you exactly what it is. It opens with studio logos, actors, and music that prepares you for fiction. Analog horror doesn't. It looks like a weather report, a public safety announcement, an old training tape, a VHS transfer uploaded by an account with almost no subscribers. It doesn't feel like a story asking for your attention. It feels like a forgotten recording that happened to survive. And that's an important difference. Analog horror isn't pretending to be real. It's pretending not to care whether you believe it. The indifference makes it feel strangely authentic. You're not just watching a story, you're examining evidence. Who uploaded this? Why was it preserved? Why does one frame look damaged? The platform turns every viewer into an investigator. That's why I think people often misunderstand the genre. They assume analog horror is about old televisions, static, distorted audio, or unsettling faces. But we've confused the language with the idea. VHS isn't the horror. Static isn't the horror. Distorted faces are not the horror. Those are only the tools. The real horror begins the moment something familiar stops making complete sense. An emergency broadcast contradicts itself. A training tape introduces instructions no one should ever need. A face looks almost human. A childhood memory suddenly feels unreliable. Nothing changes very much, just one impossible detail. But that single detail forces you to question everything around it. Throughout this video, we've talked about different creators, different monsters, and different stories. But they're all reaching towards the same idea. Analog horror doesn't ask you to watch the horror, it asks you to participate in it. It gives your mind a question it can't completely answer, and it trusts you to finish the nightmare yourself. So why does analog horror work? Because it gives your mind something it can't completely explain. Every great series we've discussed does it in its own way. Some challenge reality, others challenge authority, identity, or memory, but they all remove certainty and let your imagination fill the space that's left behind. That's why analog horror doesn't ask you to watch the horror, it asks you to finish it. Not because it hides monsters, but because it knows exactly when to stop explaining them. The moment horror becomes completely understandable, it quietly stops being horror. Which analog horror series left an image in your head that you still can't explain? Tell me in the comments. Maybe that's what the best analog horror understands. It doesn't stay with you because of what it shows you. It stays with you because of what it refuses to explain. The video ends, you close YouTube, the room falls quiet. Your monitor fades to black. For a moment, you see your reflection. Then you notice, smiling. You're not.